should kick it off and start the evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Stuchtai. I'm the director of BIX, the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security, and we have the honor to co-host this event here today with the Counter Extremism Project. So, first of all, before we get into the content, thank you very much for this opportunity, for cooperating with us on this. I was asked to give a few introductory remarks. We at BIX, we work in the field of homeland security in general, social science aspects of homeland security. We have a special focus on economic aspects. And then you could ask yourself, what brings us to this topic? Well, in fact, I think there are a lot of economic questions that are attached to the topic that we will discuss here today, one of which is closely connected with the Netz DG, or I wrote down the English translation for it, the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, because that act says that the platform provider should also be the one judging whether certain content is illegal or not, and either take it off or leave it there. While at the same time being in charge of the algorithm that decides which post I'm going to see first and which last. And the economist in me would say, wait a minute, I've learned something about the Tinbergen rule, which says one problem, one tool or one hammer, and one institution. So why give that same institution, the Facebooks, Googles of this world, two hammers to tackle the question why it is that this is the post I'm reading first, while at the same time having to decide whether the content of this post is legal or not. Maybe I will hear one answer to that question today, else I will keep on working on that one myself. The other question where maybe we hear a few arguments, probably not a solution yet, is the thing that we are discussing in Germany when it comes to the NetzDG the most. On the one hand, how far should we go to take off hate speech, extremist content, so to protect children, to protect victims, so that they don't have to see these posts or these pictures and movie clips on the Facebooks or alike. On the other hand, the question is, oh, you want me to speak into a live stream. Oh. So sorry, everyone out there on the internet, you missed the first part. So basically what I wanted to say is the question, is the platform provider more a publisher and therefore needs an editorial board to decide what it is that we want to publish, yes or no? Or is it more the digital version of the speaker's corner where they provide the beer cake to stand on and the megaphone to speak at Hyde Park, anything or everything that you want? And in between those two, we somehow need to decide. And I'm sure we will hear a few words and few arguments on that later today. So I'm sure we will have an interesting debate later on, but first I think we need some input. But the very first thing we need to do is hear a few words from Lucinda Creighton from CEP, and maybe you introduce us to CEP and today's topic as well. So thank you very much, and I hope you'll enjoy this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, for the introduction and also for co-hosting this evening. We really appreciate it, and we're always delighted to cooperate with partners here in Berlin, and we've had very successful cooperation with BIGS so far, so thank you for that. I'm delighted on behalf of CEP to welcome you all this evening. I am a senior advisor to the Counter Extremism Project. I work to coordinate our activities across Europe. And I think needless to say, there has been a huge amount of action and mobilization from regulators, from policymakers and decision makers, both in Brussels at EU level and indeed across the member states over the last number of years. And we have really been pioneering, I suppose, with our initiatives around technology to try to curb online radicalization and extremism. And I'm delighted that I am accompanied here this evening by a number of our team and our advisors, and particularly Ambassador Mark Wallace, who is the founder of the Counter Extremism Project and who is based in New York and has travelled to be with us, and also Professor Hani Farid, who you will hear from later, who has been developing this technology in partnership with the Counter Extremism Project. So we have been really, I think, having fantastic collaboration with policymakers and think tanks and influencers across the European Union over the last while, and it is really beginning to culminate now. Obviously, you have the Netz DG law here in Germany, which my colleague Olivia Knott is going to talk about in a moment, but also we have seen indications from the UK Parliament, from the French Parliament, that they intend to bring forward legislation or some form of regulation of content on the internet, and obviously the European Commission has been to the forefront and has already published its draft legislation, and that is making its way through the institutions at the moment. So a lot of activity. We have been very pleased to cooperate with CEPS, the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels, over the last number of months to produce the first piece of research on Netz DG. And while the legislation has been in place, I think, for just over 6 months now, there hasn't been any review or sort of analysis of how it's performing and whether it's working or not. So we were really keen, particularly as other parliaments now start to move to legislate, to really see if it's working. And so Olivia Knott, who's based here in Berlin, has led the research from the Counter Extremism Project side in tandem with a gentleman called Bill Etchickson, who heads up the digital policy within CEPS in Brussels. And so Olivia is going to give a quick presentation and overview of the findings of that research, which I think will then segue very nicely into introductory remarks from Professor Farid and then the panel discussion. So I'm delighted to hand over to Olivia and ask you, Olivia, to please present the findings of the research.
I assume this works as well? Yeah, is this on? Yes. Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Lucinda, and I will be quick so we can get started with the discussion. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the Network Enforcement Act, I just wanted to quickly provide an overview of what the NetzDG actually entails. So the scope of the law, it impacts all social media platforms with at least 2 million users, and they're required to have a clear, transparent reporting mechanism to be able to report one of the violations against one of 21 criminal offenses included within the scope of the Netz DG, but it's only platforms that receive at least 200 complaints that are actually obligated to submit a transparency report. Then there's strict regulations in terms of how quickly a complaint needs to be handled. So content that is explicitly illegal needs to be removed from the platform within 24 hours. Content that is more ambiguous there's more time allotted for that, so they have up to a week for that. And then even that 7-day limit can even be extended in certain cases when more background information is required. For example, if the platform needs to reach out to the user, for example, or the person who posted the content for more information. And then there's even a third option within Netz DG, which allows platforms to basically work with a self-regulation authority. And Facebook and Google are currently in the process of setting that up. So that's also within the scope of the Netz DG. The government released detailed provisions on the different fines. We kept on seeing headlines that tech companies were threatened with up to 50 million fines for failing to delete content, which is slightly misleading because it's not individual pieces of content that platforms get fined for. It's in cases of systemic failure to uphold the stipulations, to have a proper reporting mechanism, or to have an official local representative, for example, for law enforcement agencies to contact. And there was also there was an amendment basically to the Telemedia Act, which said that in some cases, users have the right to find out who their aggressor was, for example, in cases of civil lawsuits, but they do need a court order for that, to get that information. So for this study, we tried to reach out with many different stakeholder groups. We held background information or background discussions with people within government, different civil society organizations. We met with in person, also had phone calls. The tech companies, of course, we met with or spoke with Twitter, Google, and Facebook, and also had the opportunity to meet with some MPs, both within the coalition government and opposition, just to get an idea of where everyone's stance was, where everyone was standing on this issue, since people had very different ideas of what the law is and what its impact would be. So it was interesting because both people that were in favor of the Netz DG, but also the critics had a lot of criticism against the law. The people that supported regulation actually felt that the Netz DG didn't go far enough, that it lacked the teeth to be effective. For example, some said that there should be more criminal offenses included within the scope of the law, that the law should apply to not only platforms with at least 2 million users, but include all platforms, for example. Re-uploads, this was a particularly controversial issue that was initially included in the draft bill, but subsequently taken out. We heard some in favor of keeping that part inside in the bill, basically. And then the ID requirement, of course, there were concerns about the data privacy regulations, if that would be conflicting with those. A lot of criticism, of course. It was a very controversial law. Many people felt that it violated Article 14 of the e-commerce directive, because now platforms would have liability. Basically, these strict timelines would force them into liability for the content they need to remove. Many critics felt it was a privatization of law enforcement, that it's not actually the responsibility of tech platforms to decide on the legality of content, that this is something that courts should be doing, judges should be deciding on. And then, of course, the argument we heard from the tech industry is that it would incentivize hasty takedowns and therefore lead to overblocking. So what happened 6 months after the law went into effect? All platforms in Germany, this was Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Change.org, were required to submit transparency reports. And here you can see the results of the reports, which show that actually 4/5 on average of all the content was actually not removed from the platforms. And you can see, well, the most surprising aspect was actually that the number for Facebook was much lower compared to the other platforms. And we realized then that the way the law was implemented was very different, which explains these discrepancies between the different platforms. And here you can just see a comparison, graphic representation of the previous slide, again showing the difference between Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And the table is just to show that most of the content that was reported and subsequently removed related to hate speech and insult. And this gives a ranking of the different categories of content that was reported. This is to show So I mentioned before, the way the law was implemented was actually quite different depending on the platform. Facebook, unlike the other two, did not use an integrated complaint mechanism. So you have to go to the help center, and it's a separate reporting form for the Netz DG than it is for their community guidelines. And so this makes it more difficult for users or incentivizes users to file complaints according to their own community guidelines rather than the Netz DG, just based on the simplicity of the reporting process. Right, so Facebook uses a two-step review approach. They first compare all content flagged under Netz DG with their own community guidelines, and if it violates their own guidelines, they remove it globally. They don't just block it within Germany. And if the content only violates one of the 21 criminal offenses, then it's blocked in Germany. The other two, so YouTube and Twitter, both had a separate reporting. They reported all content that was flagged under Netz DG within the transparency report and did not first compare it with their own guidelines, which is why the numbers are much higher. Another difference is that Google, instead of copying the criminal offenses word for word, sort of paraphrased. For example, instead of saying incitement to hatred, they called it hate speech. Just I try and make it a bit user-friendly. This is just to show the reporting process. Netz DG, as I mentioned, it's a separate reporting form, and community guideline violations are just reported at the piece of content, basically a few clicks. This is just to show that this is a very simplification of several cases that were brought against Facebook since the beginning of the year, since Netz DG went into effect. And these relate to Facebook's own community guidelines, but of course, indirectly also Netz DG, because as we've seen with Facebook, a lot of the Netz DG complaints are absorbed within their own complaint mechanism. And there hasn't been too much guidance, it seems, from the courts. There's lots of contradictory rulings, and of course judges always have to weigh Facebook and Co.'s right to enforce their own house rules because they have their private company, so they have the right to do that, but users, of course, also have a right to free expression according to the German Constitution, of course, and so there's always this tension, and the way judges have ruled differs a lot based on the court. So just a few words on change.org. We felt it was important to include them in our analysis because they're one of the smaller platforms that were affected by Netz DG. So we wanted to know, was the cost manageable? How did it implement or how did it affect the company? And the upfront costs seem to be high relative to the annual revenues. The revenue is not based on ads. It's basically they charge a fee. It's very different revenue flow than for the others, but the upfront cost was high in the beginning, but then the platform said that in the long run, it would level out, of course, and it's just the initial setup that would cost the most. And they also agreed that Netz DG seemed favorable to it because it would contribute to less hate speech and illegal content on their platforms. Many question whether the government has played its part. I'm sure Dr. Holznagel will tell us more about that. Yes, criticisms we've heard was that the law it was implemented in haste. There was a need to do something about all the hate speech that was popping up. 2015 is when the process was started. In relation with the refugee crisis, there was a lot of backlash, for example, right-wing extremists. So the government passed the law relatively quickly, but then the other side of it is that many felt there wasn't enough time for deliberation and also perhaps not enough investment in the process. But we will, I'm sure, discuss this in the panel. We asked what might the international implications be. Of course, as Lucinda mentioned already, the European Commission has now decided to move away from the voluntary approach, at least in terms of terrorist content, and has proposed a new regulation. Different countries are now looking to legislate and regulate, so we felt it was important to understand Netz DG, see what lessons there could be learned, what implications there might be for other countries. And finally, some broad recommendations we came up with. for NetzDG, but also illegal content in general. So we felt it would be important for to have some guidance from the government, to have some clear enforcement and reporting standards, because we can see there's many differences. Some are more user-friendly than others. So there should be some guidance in terms of how a law such as NetzDG is implemented. We also felt that there should be some differentiation on content, since there's 21 criminal offenses included in the law, and we think different dangers should have different approaches. So if, for example, explicitly illegal terrorist content, child pornographic content should be removed much faster than 24 hours. Third, we felt that it was important to also have a clearinghouse for content that might have been wrongfully removed. Currently, users have the possibility to file a complaint within the Federal Office of Justice if they felt their complaint via the tech companies wasn't heard. We haven't seen the equivalent for content that might have been wrongfully removed, so we'd like to see a more formalized structure for that as well. And of course, regulation is just one aspect of tackling hate speech. The courts, the law enforcement all need to play a part. And the competencies within the federal states seem to diverge. I think some manage it better than others, some invest more in others, and this, of course, needs to be a strong component that goes hand in hand with regulation, is that violators are also, in some cases, prosecuted if necessary. And lastly, we want to continue to be able to do research, to be able to understand the implications of illegal content, to be able to follow the improvement of tech companies. How well are they doing? Are they living up to the promises? And also, of course, we feel that it's important for regulators and law enforcement authorities to have the cyber competence they need to do their job well. I'm going to stop there. We can, of course, pick up on all of these in the panel discussion. And next, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Hani Farid, for tonight. Just a quick background. Hani Farid is currently a professor at the School of Information at the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, and also a senior advisor to the Counter Extremism Project. He was previously at Dartmouth College. He just moved to California from the East Coast. Studied applied mathematics, computer science at the University of Rochester, and did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Farid is one of the pioneers of digital forensics. For those who aren't familiar, a computer science subfield that specializes in determining if digital images, audio, video, or documents have been manipulated. And he's also been doing some interesting work on hashing algorithms, but I won't steal his thunder. I will let him talk about that. So, Hani Farid, if I can call you up here, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good evening. So I'm looking forward to a vigorous and interesting debate. And as we talk about the issues that we are all contemplating, I think it's important to look a little bit at the past before we talk about the present and the future. And I will argue that the past few years have seen spectacular and troubling failures on the part of the technology industry. And I want to sort of take you through the last 2 decades of some of the problems so we can understand where we are and how we got here and how to move forward. The early 2000s saw an explosion in the creation and distribution of child sexual abuse material. Fueled largely by the quickly growing internet platforms, these platforms were asked over and over again to do something to rein in the abuses on their platforms. Their response was to claim that the problem was not that large. Once faced with overwhelming evidence as to the magnitude of the problem, the companies changed their messaging to claim that there was no technical solution to the problem. After a collaboration between myself and Microsoft led to the development of technology to disrupt the global distribution of child sexual abuse material, the companies then changed their messaging again to claim that the solution might catch legitimate material in its net, and or it wasn't clear how or who should define the material to be removed. And so we saw this moving target for us from there is no problem to there is no solution to you are going to stifle free speech and expression. And I will remind you, by the way, that in this case we were talking about child sexual abuse material. We were talking about images and videos of 12-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 2-month-olds being sexually abused, and there was a remarkable and spectacular indifference across the industry to the horrific crimes being committed on their platforms. Only after years of public pressure did the major companies relent and deploy our technology. In some cases, it took almost a decade. Despite predictions to the contrary, this technology has been hugely impactful in disrupting the global distribution of child sexual abuse material, while at the same time not leading to the problems that the technology companies and free speech groups predicted would arise. For example, last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the clearinghouse in the United States for handling cases of child abuse, received over 17 million reports of child abuse material being uploaded. Those are primarily US statistics, occupying about 5% of the world's population. 99% of those reports came from the technology that we deployed on the major social media platforms. It had a huge impact in disrupting global distribution of child abuse material, and it took almost over a decade to get the companies to agree to this. Let's fast forward, if we will, a few years, and the United States found itself in the early stages of what is now an alarming opioid epidemic, which just last year led to the deaths of 70,000 citizens in the United States alone. This epidemic is a result, of course, of a number of factors, but starting in 2003, the primary source of obtaining the illegal drugs was from illegal pharmacies advertising on Google and other platforms. After years, again, of being told of the illegal drug trade on their platform, Google simply refused to put in the necessary safeguards to ensure that people did not illegally acquire dangerous and deadly narcotics. In 2011, 8 years later, as we saw this trend, the US Department of Justice fined Google $500 million, $500 million, and forced them to admit wrongdoing for continuing to allow illegal and dangerous drugs to be advertised through their AdWords program. The investigation found that not only did Google passively allow ads for illegal pharmacies, but that for over 5 years, Google provided customer support to some of these pharmacies to assist them in placing and optimizing their advertisements and improving the effectiveness of the sale of illegal and deadly drugs. Google effectively became a drug dealer in the United States. Their employees were literally working with illegal pharmacies to tell them how to better target vulnerable populations. This was, by the way, not in the early days of Google. This happened for years and years and years. It was not a bug, it was a feature, it was baked into the system. So let's fast forward another few years. And by 2015, it was clear that the internet was being weaponized by hate and extremist groups, both domestic and international. The response from the technology giants followed a similar playbook: deny the extent of the problem, claim that no technological solution exists, claim that any solution will violate privacy and free speech, delay, delay, delay. Until public pressure or threats of legislation or actual legislation forces action, and then act anemically and just enough to squash criticism or more legislation. This is the pattern we have been seeing. So let's fast forward to today. Most recently, we've learned of the devastating consequences of misinformation campaigns on Facebook, Google, and Twitter. From the horrific violence in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, and the Philippines, to meddling in democratic elections around the globe, social media has, again, been weaponized. And the response from the industry was familiar. Mark Zuckerberg started off by saying it was, and I quote, a pretty crazy idea that fake news played a role in influencing the 2016 US elections, only then to admit, a few months later, that a small number of users saw ads from Russian trolls, to then admitting that the number was closer to 10 million users, to then admitting after congressional hearings that the number was closer to 100 million users had seen ads. From child sexual exploitation to the sale of illegal drugs, extremism, and misinformation, the titans of technology have failed us. They have shown that they are simply incapable of regulating themselves and that they put growth and profit ahead of all else. This was made stunningly apparent by Andrew Bosworth's Facebook's president for advertising and business platform when he said, and I quote in a leaked email, "Maybe it costs a life by exposing someone to bullies. Maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack coordinated on our tools. And still, we connect people. The ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect people more often is de facto good, conceding that there are bad things happening on their platform, that those things are leading to the deaths of our citizens, and it doesn't matter, this is what we do." Despite repeated claims to the contrary, thoughtful, modest, and practical solutions exist to many of the online abuses that we have been struggling with now for over 2 decades. As just one example, we at the Counter Extremism Project have developed technology, so-called robust hashing technology, that can quickly and accurately find anything from child sexual abuse material to terrorism-related material. This technology was available for years, and in some cases decades before technologies fully embraced and adopted it, if even at times anemically and with minimum effort. Although there are significant challenges with managing the scale and speed of the major online platforms, this technology shows that technological solutions to reining in the worst abuses online are possible. The issue is no longer, can we do it? It's will we do it? While we have made some progress as compared to a few years ago, there are still significant gaps in the development and deployment of technology to quickly and accurately find and remove the worst of the worst content. In addition to improving technology, the industry must do more to develop and deploy new technologies, to contend with an ever-changing landscape, and this must go beyond the vague promises of AI will solve the problem in some unspecified number of years from now. Tech companies must also institute a clear and a consistently applied framework that brings transparency to content regulation. The current system is opaque and vague and inconsistent. These frameworks need to go beyond the boilerplate lines embedded in hundreds of pages of terms of service, and they need to create a systematic, even-handed, and transparent process for reviewing content, which we do not have today. Given the pattern of behavior that we have seen over the past 2 decades, I'm afraid that the time of trusting the industry to self-regulate is long over. We have been waiting, and we have been waiting, and we have been waiting, and it hasn't happened. Instead, we must continue to implement legislation that thoughtfully contends with the issues at hand, while making sure that any legislation does not cripple small startups, thus leading to a further enshrinement of the monopolies that are Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Legislation can be thoughtful, there can be unintended consequences, and so we need to move both aggressively but also very carefully to make sure that we don't have the unintended consequences that will restrict future growth of the technology industry. We must also pressure advertisers that fuel the industry to be more socially conscious and to wield their enormous power more responsibly. And we as the public and the media need to continue to pressure the titans of tech to do better, much, much better than they have. Collectively, it is our responsibility to help the technology sector find their moral compass that has been all too broken for the past 2 decades. Thank you.
May I ask the panelists to join? Excellent. Thank you, Professor Farid. Now, I can promise you one thing, this will not be boring. In case you were afraid of maybe passing out or falling asleep, this is most likely not going to happen. You might have heard that this is a kind of discussion that is actually talking about the issues in depth. And we're not into the sugar-coating business. At least this is, I think, how Professor Farid introduced himself, based on lots of technological work as well that you couldn't highlight, I guess, due to the limits of time, but we will speak about that, I guess, a little bit. So my name is Alexander Ritzmann. I'll be the moderator for this discussion. I'm a senior research fellow at the BICS, and I also advise the Counter Extremism Project, and I do a couple of other things, but that's not important. More important is that this is an excellent panel, and I'm actually very excited to be here on stage with you. So let me start by briefly introducing the other three speakers, and then we have a quick round of reactions or just your own statements to bring in some additional insights and food for thought and discussion, and then we'll have a real also discussion amongst ourselves here, all right? And I'll start with Jason Pielmeyer, who works for the Global Network Initiative, which is an organization that aims at enhancing the protections of free expression and privacy globally, with a strong tech component, I think. That's safe to say. Thank you for being here. We have Christina Dinar from the Amadeus Antonio Foundation, a German NGO that, and I highlighted that as well because I really like that, works to strengthen democratic civil society and eliminate hate in Germany. That is a tall order. We're very eager to hear about how that is going and how we can do that. And we have one of the authors of the law that has been actually just been presented by my colleague, Frau Knot, Dr. Holznagel from the Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection. So in combination with Professor Farid, I think we have everyone we need for an amazing discussion. So I would like to ask you to start with your input. We said a maximum of 5 minutes maybe, and then we bring in our other two guests, and then we start the discussion.
Sure, thank you, Alexander. Can everybody hear me? Great. So let me start by thanking CEP and BIGS for organizing the event and for inviting me to participate. For those who don't know the Global Network Initiative, we are a network of member organizations that fall into 4 categories. So we have ICT companies, which includes both tech platforms as well as mobile network operators and equipment vendors. We also have civil society organizations, human rights groups, as well as media freedom organizations, academics, and then investors. So all of these disparate stakeholders gathered under the same tent, sharing a common mission to try and work towards the protection of free expression and privacy online. Our focus, GNI is 10 years old, and our focus primarily is at the intersection between governments and companies and how governments, what sort of regulations and laws governments put in place and how tech companies respond to those in ways that will best protect the rights of their users. So that's GNI. GNI has done work on the issues related to intermediary liability and extremist content, and I can recommend some of the work product that we've done on that. Otherwise, though, also just note that responses and reactions from me outside of that scope are purely my own. So let me just say a few things about NetzDG, because GNI has been public and on the record about NetzDG. When NetzDG was being considered in Parliament, we put out a statement. We made 3 key points that I think we still stand by today. The first is that the outsourcing of content decisions to private platforms is concerning from both a democratic accountability as well as a human rights perspective. Second is that putting the onus on companies with the potential for fines and in some instances potentially large fines, although not in all instances, would sort of tilt the scales of their decision making in a direction that would lead to more blocking and potentially over blocking of content. I think in that regard, the transparency reports and the study are very helpful in providing a bit of clarity as to sort of what is happening and what isn't happening. But I would emphasize that there's still a lot that we don't know. First of all, it's just 6 months. So there's going to be another report, series of reports soon, and we'll need to keep tracking kind of what's happening and what the trends are. But secondly, there's a lot of potential blocking that the companies are doing under their own terms of service that may be that is happening because the law exists and provides a framework that creates a certain pressure on them in Germany, but that is being cited in terms of their terms of service. And so it's not appearing necessarily as takedowns under NetzDG, but rather takedowns pursuant to their own community guidelines. Even if there is not a sort of dramatic increase in the number of takedowns that's been happening, I think it's very important to emphasize that that doesn't mean that there are not human rights being impacted, free expression primarily. So we have examples, right, from the court cases that you cited, Olivia, of individuals who feel like their content was taken down in violation of their free expression rights under German law, and in some instances they have been backed up by the courts. Those are individual cases, but one has to imagine for each individual who actually has the temerity to go to court and the resources to do so, how many other individuals are potentially out there. Separately, I think there is sort of beneath all of that a certain chilling effect that is hard to measure and that is hard to understand. There was the very sort of famous example of the Titanic magazine tweets that were taken down right after the law went into effect in January, and that was acknowledged to be in error, but that certainly had a repercussion and could have had and may still be having impacts on individuals who choose not to post things satirically or to criticize certain people because of the potential that they could have their content removed. So very quickly, I'll just touch on the other points that we made. The other key point that we made, which is that we think NetzDG is inconsistent with Germany's international human rights law obligations. So Article 19 of the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, sets out a three-part test for laws that restrict freedom of expression. So such laws have to meet the legality, legitimate purpose, and necessity principles of international human rights law. We're particularly concerned on the necessity and proportionality side that NetzDG, although ostensibly about hate speech, actually bans a lot of content unrelated to hate speech. So there are 22 provisions of German law that are cited, some of which have to do with things like defamation, individual defamation, as well as defamation of religion, critiques of the state. There's a whole lot in there that's not really related to hate speech. And we questioned at the time and continue to question if really what the German parliament and politicians were concerned about was hate speech, why take such a broad approach? Why not focus more specifically on that? So I'll stop there. The other point that I would make is just about, and this was talked about a bit in the presentation as well, is this law may not have sort of tremendously grievous human rights implications in a country like Germany, which has a fairly functioning democracy and a court system where people can go for redress and a political system that is responsive to people's concerns. But it is being cited by many other jurisdictions who are implementing similar laws where we don't have those checks and balances.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sure. You might be wondering why there's no representative from the tech industry. We really tried. We asked Facebook, we asked Google, we asked Bitkom, anyone to speak on the issue. So nobody had time. Everyone's very busy. It's the end of the year. I guess that's the main reason. Anyway, so we're extra thankful that you bring in a perspective, not necessarily from the industry, but from being critical regarding the law and possible implications, unintended consequences. That was very helpful. Thank you for that. Ms. Dinar, please.
Yeah, I come from. Can you hear? Yeah. I come from a foundation that deals with civil rights and democracy and strengthening that. And we feared very much that the NetzDG would be fear to democracy in a way, over-blocking as well. You said it. As well, that we also still see that actually the people who are affected by hate speech, they're not helped very much by the law. The law it was said before, there is different mechanism of reporting. It's actually not clear. I don't know if anyone here ever did a report and experienced it by itself. some of the reporting system, I can mention Twitter, is very insulting and fearing. It will ask you, are you sure you want to report it? So with these numbers that come out of the transparency reports, I'm very cautious because we don't actually know what happened to the users and how many actually went through this whole process of reporting, because it's actually quite a lot of clicks. And those ones who are affected, usually we know that they have a specific situation, that they are not helped by a long, difficult process. And many of them I also question, I wonder how many users actually know the NetzDG or know what it is. And I have noticed that only Google explains you in doing a report what it actually is and what it is for. So I think many flaggings are still under community standards because there's not a lot of knowledge about it. It's kind of, I say, it's a nerd topic in a way. We know about what we talk here, but what is with the general user who wants to report content? Difficult. Another thing that we also, I like very much, and we also think that it's a good idea, is a clearing house that also takes the decision of the platforms into a public space, into a more controlled and transparency and democratic process. This clearinghouse that we see has also the idea to help those ones who are affected by hate speech and who want to report, or maybe they just have their accounts hacked and they want them back, because if somebody misused your accounts, you have to send your data off to them in order to get your account back. So there's a lot of small little problems to help those ones who are affected by it. Now, the extremist content, I think we are very, very clear. That needs to be taken off, but we work more in this field of hate speech and what is also called dangerous speech. So dangerous speech is this speech that inspires violence and that lets people allow to be hateful. That are usually not extremists, definitely not. They are kind of orientating themselves and speaking out, and there we have right-wing extremists, but we also have populist characters with interest, trolls, all these kind of issues. So they play also a role. And one last thing I just noticed, and I just remembered that there's 2 million users you need to have to be reporting under NetzDG, and I actually speak with a lot of small platforms that have local communities, that have servers in Germany, that have maybe communities up to 2 million, and I know they will fall very soon into NetzDG because technology will not be used less, it will be used more. And Facebook will also probably use, the small platforms will, I think, also take over some of these Facebook users. So what's with these small growing platforms that might fall under NetzDG that don't have the capacity, not the money to enforce this whole project? So that's my thoughts so far. And I think that in the law, it's thought 2 million, but maybe in 2 years, we have so many million people using the internet and the platform that 2 million will be overcome a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Nahr. Dr. Holznagel, does this feel like somebody speaking badly about your child, or what's your state emotionally? Please share your perspective on the law and everything related to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, a little bit it felt like this, but to be honest, I mean, it's not my child. Yeah, it was too much of an honor first to say that other people were drafting the core version of the law. But first, when I heard Olivia speaking, I thought I was a little bit puzzled because it was a perfect presentation of the NetzDG. I cannot add something now to it. And Dr. Farid, it was very impressive because I absolutely agree because you showed actually very clearly to us that first we need accountability for the big tech companies, and second that it's not enough to make a regulation. You need to make compliance another cost of doing business. Yet otherwise they will not. You need some pressure, so to say. Yeah? And before starting, what I wanted to say, I'm also glad for the picture with the 2 hammers that you used. You ask who gave these companies these 2 hammers, and I would say they built them themselves. I mean, with the algorithm, they built themselves very clearly, but also the other hammer that they decide or that they have to decide about taking criminal content down. In a way, they also built this hammer themselves because they grew very big. They control content. They make profit with this content very much. And it's a legal regime that is known everywhere over the world, that when you make profit and you have control, there comes some certain kind of liability with it. It's known as secondary liability or Störerhaftung in Germany. So also this hammer or this position to need to take decisions once they are notified, of course. Yeah, they don't necessarily need to search for this content, but this hammer that also in a way they built themselves. They grew so big that they also, the responsibility came with it. So that's what I also liked another picture that you said, there's a freedom of speech issue, and then we want to protect some child. So it's true, there's freedom of speech issues on the one side, and we need to protect certain persons on the other side. But I think what we are facing is a more complex dilemma, because there's freedom of speech on both sides. So because a lot of people, once they're faced with hate speech, criminal hate speech online, there are studies showing this from Amnesty International, for example, they will withdraw from discourse online. So when you're talking about taking down criminal hate speech, you're not only talking about taking down expression and silencing someone, you are also talking about keeping the floor open for people who want to be part of the legitimate discourse. So it's also strengthening free expression. But of course, it's clear in a complicated world and a complicated field of regulation, you need to find a balance as a lawmaker, and I think that's what we did with the Netz DG. And another point is that it's a complex task. There's a lot of problems, and of course, something like the Netz DG can only be a small brick stone of a much broader approach. So, and we have no problem in agreeing and admitting that the Netz DG is just a small part of a bigger strategy. So I just want to touch a few of these aspects, which are the core rules of the Netz DG, which are such small brickstones. The internet is very powerful, so also hate speech online can be very powerful. So one reaction to solve the problem can also be to empower the users or the victims, which you can go media literacy or you can do other things. But another thing of empowering is also to give the users or the victims a better opportunity to use legal solutions. For example, to make it easier to sue big companies. And if you're here in Germany and you want to sue a company in California, it can be very complicated, but it becomes easier once you have persons authorized to receive service here in Germany, contact points. So actually, that's what we did with the Netz DG. So we made it obligatory for big social networks to have a contact point here in Germany. So this is a big step of empowering. 1 minute left. So good. I will be very brief with the other points. Empowering is also through reporting channels. The Netz DG makes it obligatory to have user-friendly reporting channels. This is only so that users can report where's the criminal content online. This is very legitimate, and it should be very easy for the companies because it's their business model to do things user-friendly. But in these cases, you have to create some pressure to do it, yeah? And the other thing about empowering is that we want to make informed decisions, so transparency is important. The Netz DG also creates an obligation for transparency reports, and of course also very balanced and soft incentives, as I think, to take down clear criminal content. So that's for now. I will be glad to go into further details.
Excellent, thank you. So now we've heard input statements, we've heard a keynote speech. I don't know what the most searched word on Google is on their search engine. I hope it's why, right? That would make me happy, that most people use that platform to find out things. So maybe we can start with that. Professor Farid, why is the industry so reluctant? You touched on it a little bit in your presentation, but I think it is important to highlight and to make it more clear what you said, that there's first denial that there is a problem, then that there's no solution, and then that there's delay or just doing what is absolutely necessary. Because the people I know from the tech industry are not bad people. They're just decent people like everybody else. So what are the incentives, the mechanisms that lead to this process that you highlight?
Yeah. I agree. I don't think they're bad people. I don't think they like child pornography. I don't think they like bomb-making videos. I don't think that. But I think the reality is that taking down content is bad for business. What you have to understand about most of the social media platforms is that they monetize our data, whether that's our personal data by tracking us or it's the information that we put on their sites. That's the monetization, right? So taking down content is bad for business. And it's complex. And I agree it's complex. But when you are a multinational global company and with trillions of dollars, I think it's what you said. You own that complexity now. You built this thing, and that is now your responsibility. And I will point out that I think the industry does something a little disingenuous when it hides behind their concern for free expression. And I'll tell you why I think that. So because I'm a nerd, I was reading the terms of service of YouTube this afternoon.
I also did.
And it's fascinating. So let me just read to you a few things. If you really think YouTube is concerned about free expression, your terms of service that you agreed to were, you will not submit falsehoods or misrepresentations that could damage YouTube. Okay, fine. You will not submit any material which is obscene, defamatory, or otherwise objectionable. YouTube will remove all content considered inappropriate. So already YouTube has agreed that certain things don't belong on the platform with spectacular vagueness. So if they're so concerned about free expression, then why is this in the terms of service? Facebook has terms of service that says you cannot post adult pornography, perfectly protected speech, and as far as I can tell, about 50% of the internet. So if we're so concerned about free expression, why do we put limits on this type of material? So Facebook did it because adult pornography on the site would have made it more of a cesspool than it is. That's bad for business. If we're so concerned about free expression, why is Google creating a censored version of search for China? Because that's where they've conquered the rest of the world. That's the only 1.3 billion users that are left. And so I think it's fine to talk about free expression, but then we can't be hypocritical about it. We can't deny free expression when it's bad for business and then enforce it when it's good for business. It doesn't work that way. So I think at the end of the day, there is a serious disconnect between taking responsibility for the horrors that are happening on the platforms, and we can't deny that. This is not an abstract idea. We know that people are watching videos on YouTube, becoming radicalized, and committing horrendous acts of violence. We know that these platforms are being used to distribute and share horrific violence being imposed on our children. We know that these platforms are being used to distribute illegal drugs that are costing tens of thousands of lives. There has to be a responsibility for this. Every industry, the auto industry, the airline industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, every industry has regulations because left to their own devices, they will maximize profits at all other costs. I don't see why the technology industry is any different. And the only reason it's different is because they give us shiny new things that make us very excited, and we have sort of ignored them for the last 20 years. But I think that time is over now, and we and they have to take more responsibility.
Thank you. That was a clear point. Is anyone having a completely different perspective of why there's such a delay, and often first the perspective that the problem cannot be fixed, and like why is the industry acting the way it does? Is there someone here who has a conflicting interpretation of why the industry is acting the way it does? Or should we move to the what already, from the why to the what to the how to?
I just would like to add that I think that this Silicon Valley mentality or ideology sort of grow out of this responsibility is something very, very far away, and the self-understanding to be part of the society that has to be this kind of responsibility. I think it kind of got out of the teenager stuff now. Yeah, they have to grow up, and it'd be interesting to watch how the idea will adapt to this responsibility. But I see them constantly still denying this, society's social responsibility for togetherness in peace. Yeah.
Okay. So the industry needs to be treated like any other industry. Is that what seems to be something we can work with? Okay, we'll go. Is there anything you guys want to add?
Well, so I don't speak on behalf of the industry or on behalf of any companies, but I think that it is worth sort of discussing and thinking about different categories of potentially harmful content distinctly, right? So child sexual abuse material is a particularly problematic and universally condemned and universally prohibited category of content that is generally pretty easy to identify, right? There's the famous adage of kind of, so you know it when you see it. That's not always true, right? It's different countries have different definitions of who's a minor and what constitutes abuse. But in general, compared to, for example, hate speech or blasphemy or libel, personal defamation, it's pretty easy to understand and recognize. And so I think for some of those other categories, one of the reasons why the industry and the platforms specifically have had a hard time and have been reluctant to be overly aggressive in policing content is because they are facing a conflict of laws, right? They operate globally, and there are 190 plus jurisdictions that tell them different things about what content should be removed. That's also one of the reasons why their terms of service are so broad, right? Because they would prefer to have a uniform set of terms of service that allow them to make that decision based on not based on having to interpret, German law versus Austrian law versus Zimbabwean law, but being able to say, well, this is regardless of whether it's illegal in any particular jurisdiction, this is not content that we want on our platform, because this isn't the community that we want to foster. This isn't the type of sort of interaction that we want to facilitate. Right. So I think which goes to the point Dr. Farid made about this is complex, and it's complex in different ways for different categories of content. So I would just say that it just because we may have taken one approach with regard to one set of content, it doesn't necessarily mean that approach makes sense in another context.
Okay. Thanks. So there seems to be an agreement that the issue is complex. And it seems to be that the German solution to a complex problem is a law. And nobody's surprised who's German, right? So Germans like when there's something that is complicated and not clear to pass a law to fix it. Now, after 6 months of implementation of the law, is the law fixing any of the problems that we've been discussing? Is there any idea to amend the law or even to cancel the law? Dr. Holznagel?
I mean, there are parties who want the law to be abolished, of course, but our impression at the ministry is that it's very fresh, right? It's 9 months or 10 months that the core rules are now in effect, and our impression is that basically it works well. So we see some successes. For example, the big networks, which first very important, all signal they want to comply. So this is an important step. And the contact points that I mentioned, which are for civil procedures and also for law enforcement as the contact points, all big networks, they named these persons. This is a big step because if you think of Facebook, if you are the CEO of Facebook, and you think about the question, do I really want to have a point of contact in every country, or is it better only in California? So people who want to sue me, they have to go to California. So this decision to really set it up in Germany, this has an effect, an important effect, I think. And the reporting channels, they were also worked over by the big networks. Of course, we see differently, and we agree that Facebook makes it pretty complicated. And this is also something that the federal agency, which is in charge now of enforcing the act, is looking very closely. So I cannot tell you more details, but if you are interested in it, Google this whole topic in 3 months or so. Maybe that will be something interesting. And so, but this is not a problem of the law. It's a problem that now it needs to be enforced, right? Because user-friendliness of the reporting channels. But for example, YouTube, I think this is a step forward. And transparency reports. For the first time, we have all big networks. They have published transparency reports. Maybe there are some issues, but this is more transparency than before. It was a black box. So, to sum it up, there are some things, of course, to do still, and we will do certain things. But basically, we think it's working, and there's not the need to do major overhaul.
So to me, it seems that also passing a law is somewhat complex. At least the results are not that clearly to understand right now. Maybe it's the timeline. So when we looked at the why question, why the industry has been behaving, I think we heard that one one explanation, it's their nature. It's incentivized to have as much traffic and content as possible, and it's against that nature to delete proactively. And the other one is that it's very complicated and very complex. And we heard from what to do about it, a law as a solution. What else is there we can do? Maybe Professor Farid, what can technology do to help fix this issue?
So let me say, I don't fundamentally object to legislation, but I will point out that the reason we have legislation is because there have been years and years, and in some cases decades, of action from the technology company, despite significant warnings that if they do not get their act together, there's going to be legislation, which is way worse for them. Because now if every country starts passing legislation, this is bad for the technology companies. But we are here because they have failed to act to deal with the problems on their platform. And I think this is a problem of their own making. I absolutely agree that there are technologies that can deal with the very difficult issues that we are talking about, from child exploitation to extremism. I will point out, by the way, that the big tech companies, when they monetize your data, the way they sell that service to the advertisers, they tell them how they can leverage big data and the scale and the magnitude of their platforms to target, advertise almost to individuals. So somehow, when they have the scale and the complexity when it comes to monetizing, they're extremely smart and extremely efficient and extremely good at it. But when it comes to reining in the abuses, that scale seems to make them incredibly stupid. And you can't really have it both ways, right? You can't take advantage of the big data and all that information and AI and data analytics to monetize, but then pretend somehow that you can't deal with the abuses. I don't buy that story. The issue is where the resources are going. Look at the size of the teams that deal with abuse, and look at the size of the teams in these companies that deal with the revenue and the ad, and that will tell you everything you need to know. So if you want to be serious about the abuses, let's be serious about it, but I don't think we are right now. And so I think that if resources were moved from one part of the company to another, or resources brought in to deal with the abuses, we could develop significant technology that I think would have avoided the legislation. Nobody wants to pass the legislation. We're not eager to do that. We do that as a last resort. So I'm hoping now that with increasing pressure from the EU, from the Germans, from the Brits, hopefully from the Americans at some point, the companies will start getting the message that they have to start being better at the self-regulation. And to me, the legislation is really a warning sign of things to come, and we'll see if the technology companies respond. I think to their credit now, they're at least admitting the problem. We've stopped denying the problem exists. Right? We admit that fake news is a significant problem in violence around the world and in disrupting democratic elections. We admit that terrorists are weaponizing our platforms, but now we have to take that next step, and I think that's what we have to see over the next year or so.
Okay. Maybe as a quick add-on, I think Mark Zuckerberg and others are saying AI is going to fix this. So artificial intelligence, deep neural networks, whatever you want to call it, whatever it is going to reduce that complexity that we seem to agree on. Mr. Pielmeyer, is that something you're looking forward to AI solutions, to human rights concerns?
No. So personally, I'm not looking forward to a world in which all of our content is mediated by artificial intelligence. I think that given the scale of the content that platforms have to process, and AI and machine learning necessarily has to be part of how they, sort of trigger a review and how they identify content that may violate the law or their community guidelines. But I think there are real sort of problems with the way that AI is developed and the way that machine learning currently operates in terms of its ability to sort of contextualize and understand nuance, that I think it would be, frankly, dystopian if we found ourselves in a world where companies, without any kind of human review, without any kind of mechanism for appeal or redress, were filtering content out based on some mathematical formula. And this goes to what Dr. Farid was talking about. I mean, the challenge with legislation is that not only could you have 190 different pieces of legislation all over the world, but even if you had the same legislation, you'll have different kinds of enforcement, right? And so, the government in Myanmar might decide that posts that are made that are critical of the government are in fact hateful and therefore need to be taken down under a hate speech law. That's not something you would expect to happen in Germany. And so it really gets complicated once you start thinking about all the different ways that these jurisdictions operate. So I think AI is going to be part of the sort of solution set. But I am hopeful that it won't be relied on too much. Certainly the current capabilities for AI don't seem to be adequate for that kind of nuanced decision.
And I would argue they're not even close. Not even close to deal with the scale of the internet, of the billions of uploads a day. Right. I agree with you, by the way, it's going to be part of a solution, but what the tech companies have to get their head around is that they need bodies. And I think they've been avoiding this for a long time because it's expensive to hire people. But the fact is we need well-qualified, well-trained, and well-taken care of people to moderate what's happening with the assistance of technology.
And to your point earlier about them sort of waking up to the problem, I mean, they have hired, Facebook and Google in particular, have hired tens of thousands of people just in the last year. Yeah. Not just in Germany specifically, because they have to comply with the Netz DG, but all over the world and in places like Myanmar. So, I think that's a positive sign. I think you're right that has to be another part of the solution.
Right. But in fairness, they were incredibly slow in Myanmar. I mean, for a long time, they had one interpreter, and then they doubled it to 2.
I will not argue against that.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Christina, Christmas is approaching.
For you.
If you would have 2 wishes, one for the government, the legislation, the administration, on how to approach this issue, and one to the industry on how to deal with this, what would you ask for?
I think for the industry to make it more user-friendly and actually also to enforce more community to participate actually in this flagging process, because I notice, people are paid for it, but you could actually work very well with communities together in order to deal with that problem. And then there's also this part that I think dangerous speech is this kind of speech that happens between people that AI cannot tackle, but we also need to deal with that. So I see more civil society coming more into a cohesion and better debates without hateful, toxic atmosphere. That's something only people can create, not the machine and not the platform, but they could give money, they could enforce it, they can support initiatives, community building, all this sort of stuff I think needs to happen. And that people identify with community standards. That can also happen a lot, that the hate speech itself, especially in the civil part, which is not so easy to tackle, that's something people need to do with each other, with the technology. And for the law, I think that there's many things. If I more suggest something. If you want this law to be accepted by also user or to appreciate it, I think really people need to be more informed about it. People need to understand what's good about it, and in a way, I think that just to reduce it to a minimum, and the problem with toxic speech we don't solve with that law. So that's still. Maybe it's not in your sword, but other people need to take care of. And I think also that, there is part in education and in other fields that really are urgent to be done. And technology cannot solve it, and this law also not. So was it?
Yeah. Can I just plus one the idea of sort of community involvement as another part of the solution set? And I think that's also something that we're seeing some progress being made there with the companies realizing that neither AI nor, frankly, even their paid interpreters are going to really have this sort of sufficient depth of knowledge to really understand how one term used in Germany might be offensive, but the same term used in German in Austria might not be, and and in lots of different languages all over the world. And so communities are extremely important. Civil society is extremely important, and we're seeing more outreach there. And I would just want to for those who haven't seen it, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kaye, recently put out a report on content moderation and human rights and free expression. And he sort of endorsed this idea of social media councils at the national level being able to sort of be a resource for companies for some of these hard decisions.
Thank you. Dr. Holznagel.
Also
Back to
Christmas
Christmas.
wish?
Yes, I mean, also if you like, you could share some of the inside story, how the law, did the lawmakers have fun drafting that law? Was it something they were happy to get up in the morning to go to, or was it a tool to force the industry that needed to be done because all the levels of communications that were interesting and warm never led to the results that the government was looking for? What was the thinking behind passing that law? We heard about that it was passed very quickly and maybe not everybody had been involved, but then there was a federal election and it had to be passed before that. But what was the thinking from the government? Why do we really want to pass that law?
So the Christmas wish
also,
yeah?
Yes.
Do we get one too? Yeah.
I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, if we're good.
I mean, it was not that the politicians or members of parliament just woke up one day and thought, no, we do this law, it's somehow interesting. There was a story before, it was a task force hate speech where the government was talking to the big companies and actually they were making like a promise, a self-regulatory promise that we take down within 24 hours most of the manifestly illegal content and so on. So first this was a soft step, it was tried, and then there was an evidence fact-finding. There was a monitoring was conducted in Germany by a very profound organization, which is very trustful, and I think no one, Jugendschutz.net, and they just tried. They acted like normal users and notified the networks with manifestly illegal content and looked, okay, what is the ratio to take down? And this showed differences. Some networks were good, but other big networks, a lot of room to get better. And it was true that then the law was pretty fast. Sometimes people say, be faster, that draws criticism. In this case, they say, you are too fast.
Move fast and break things is something I've heard.
Just one idea I want to reject, because sometimes people say, you only passed this law because you wanted to protect your election. Yeah? But to be very precise, the law went into effect after the election. So it was not to somehow protect, and I don't see how it can protect the election, really. I mean, I really don't think this has an effect on where you put your vote. And Christmas?
Yes.
So I would, two things. I'm because I also always say this, that we need to do other things also. State attorneys, criminal law enforcement, and so we need to get better police and media literacy at schools, and so, and the government has to do this. It's true. So it's finger pointing at my colleagues, actually. So, it's true. I really wish that this would. The state is moving slow, and there's something done. But this was a Christmas wish to be much better there. And the other thing is because people often tell me, Netz DG, okay, in Germany it works, but don't you see the precedent that you set for other countries, like in authoritarian regimes and so on? They copy the law and then it has really bad consequences. And I agree, that is true, can have bad consequences if copied. But what is the real problem behind it? It's other countries without rule of law and not democratic society. Of course, such a law can have a problem. So my wish is, the rule of law, which also gets under fire, and also in Europe, that we really fight from our hearts more and we protect it and strengthen it wherever we can. It's not the topic here, but
okay.
That's my wish.
That's a big wish. Perfect. Now let's open up for discussion with you. There should be a microphone. Yes. The microphone, I think, is up front. Perfect. So if you're interested in discussing with us, briefly say who you are. If possible, inform then of a question, participate in the discussion. If you really, really have to, make it a quick statement. So who is interested in joining us? Yes, here. The lady, perfect. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for sharing. Super insightful. Jill from Global Public Policy Institute. I have a question regarding, so I agree with like most of the points. I think, for example, Facebook will not stop people from producing or sharing content because this is their business model. So we can talk about like fact checkers and things, but all of these things are sort of just band-aids to a bigger problem. I kind of want to get your thoughts on other forms of regulation. So for example, competition policy. Do you sort of see these other things that are not new, like because these are existing forms of regulation? So I think the Netz DG is obviously a good step forward. Like you say, it's a smaller part of a broader approach. But what are your thoughts on either like antitrust or competition? Because for example, like Facebook they buy WhatsApp and they buy Instagram, and regulation doesn't really help the situation. So just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
We collect a few, I think. And if you don't address a specific speaker, the speakers will decide who wants to. Please.
Thank you. Jasmine El-Gamal from the Atlantic Council. I guess this is specifically for Dr. Farid, but it's also open to anybody. My discomfort with policing content online or trying to take down content online, this is specifically for extremist content and hate speech. So you talk a lot about Anwar al-Awlaki's videos, and you use that as a way to demonstrate why YouTube hasn't been doing enough or hadn't been doing enough for a long time. My question is, anybody in this room, hopefully, can listen to Anwar al-Awlaki's videos and we won't be radicalized because we have proper education, we have all these resiliencies that are built into us that make us immune to extremist content online. And because it's so difficult to really say what is extremist and what is hate speech, and even if it is hate speech, if someone is online saying I hate Jews or you should kill Muslims or whatever, should we really be trying to take that freedom of speech away from him, or should we be trying to make sure that his message doesn't resonate with the audiences that he's tracking? It also makes it really difficult for people who are trying to counter extremism, whether it's law enforcement or anybody else, to understand how these extremists work and what kind of narratives they use to draw people into their world. The guy who was charged with the synagogue shooting in the US recently was basically saying everything that he thought online. We could have learned from that. We could have tried to address that. We could have countered that instead of trying to take down that website or his comments. And then it's almost like pretending that the problem doesn't exist. So what do you say to that?
Yeah. Jasmine, yeah?
Yeah, and let's stick with these two.
Okay,
you can
good.
start if you like.
So, first of all, I think it's important to understand that we have always limited speech. We don't have free speech in the US. There's limits to speech. You can't just say anything you want, anytime you want. So in the world we live in, we as a society have deemed that there are limits to speech because there are certain speech that are dangerous. Yeah, that's been established law for decades, right? So what we are simply saying is that the online world is not special, that it doesn't hold some special stature that the speech doesn't belong or everything belongs just because you're typing into Facebook or to Twitter. I think we should acknowledge that there is a gray area. There is certain speech that it is not clear whether it is hate speech or extremist speech. And by the way, I will say that is also true in the child exploitation space. There is material that is vague and confusing, but when we have images of 4-year-olds being raped, we can be very clear about that. And I think the same is true in the counterterrorism space. There are bomb-making videos that show people how to build suicide vests and go out and kill people. I think most of us can agree that that probably should not be on the internet. There's also speech that shows beheadings or threatens of beheadings. I think we can also agree that doesn't have a lot of value. Anwar al-Awlaki is a fascinating person, right? So first of all, this is an American citizen that President Obama ordered a drone strike on because he was deemed to be so dangerous. So this is somebody we literally dropped a bomb on and killed, and yet he remained on YouTube radicalizing suicide bomber after suicide bomber after suicide bombing. Was there a cost associated with removing his material from online? Yes. But was there a cost of leaving it on? a phenomenal cost. And our job is to sort of weigh those two things. There's always going to be a cost of removing things, or almost always. But you have to ask what's in the other hand, right? And I think we as a society have always agreed there are limits to speech. And we weigh the individual rights with the social rights. And those are different for different societies. And we are simply asking that the online platforms make those same assessments. Are they hard decisions? Absolutely. But here's the thing about where our technology comes in. We think that decisions should be made slowly, carefully, and thoughtfully. But once they're made, those decisions should be locked in, allow the technology to take over, and to apply those rules in a transparent and consistent and efficient manner without catching in other things. And we think that can actually be done. Yeah?
All right.
I hope I answered the question. Okay.
Anyone else would like to jump on that?
Yeah, so I don't really have anything to say to the question about antitrust and competition law, except to say that if there were sort of, if the content is distributed broader, in some ways that's a harder problem to solve if you're trying to take down particular content. At least in the world we live in now, there's a relatively small number of platforms that traffic in most of the content that you're concerned about, and so. But I don't have a position on antitrust specifically. To Jasmine's point, I just want to say, so we do a lot of work in GNI with the UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and work with, in that context, a number of groups that do counter speech, right? So these are groups who are dedicated to trying to engage with vulnerable populations who are targeted by extremists and counter the messages that extremists are using to recruit them to violence. And most of them, I can't speak for all of them, but most of what I've heard from them is concern about too much content being taken down, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, Jasmine, that, you know, in order for them to be effective at counter speech, they have to know what are the messages, what are the tactics that the extremists are using. Also, when we are overbroad, and I say we generally, whether it's governments or companies, in what gets taken down, a lot of the collateral damage tends to happen to that counter speech, right? So counter speech uses a lot of the same terminology, will quote the same religious verses, will use sometimes even similar images to be effective with the same audience that the extremists are targeting. And so sometimes it gets taken down accidentally, but there is a lot of sort of accidental collateral damage. So unless you think that this is only a concern that's raised by civil society sort of NGOs, I used to work at the State Department, and I was involved in a number of conversations that we were having about terrorist content online. And some of the most vocal advocates against taking a broader approach to content takedown were from law enforcement and the intelligence community, because they were concerned that their ability to gain insight into the most sort of serious plots and the most serious individuals, most concerning individuals and groups, would be limited if speech was taken down before it was put up.
So is there, just briefly, please. So what do we do?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to this kind of broad toolkit, right? So part of it is educating users generally, digital literacy, so that people are more resilient. Part of it is figuring out who the most vulnerable communities are who are being targeted, and trying to intervene specifically with them to sort of discredit the terrorist narrative or the extremist narrative. Part of it is going to be taking down content when it is, you know, really actionable content, or content that really is clearly, you know, being spread widely in a way that's dangerous. But hopefully that's not, you know, that we don't try and sort of solve all the problems with hammers, to go back to the analogy, because I think, you know, we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
And not every problem is a nail, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you want
Can I just add one thing? And so, to the point of taking down material to interfere with law enforcement, when material is taken down, it doesn't have to disappear. We can have reporting mechanisms where law enforcement authorities, officials are notified of that. And there are instances where the material can be asked to be kept up for investigative purposes. Yeah. So I think there are mechanisms for dealing with exactly those things. By the way, we heard the same thing in the child exploitation, that taking down the material was going to cause problems for law enforcement. We haven't really seen that manifested, but I think that there are ways of dealing with that in a way that are thoughtful and complicated, but I think there are mechanisms for it.
So let me add more complexity. So what is harder now than maybe a year ago or 5 years ago is to stumble into ISIS, for example, right? So if you would be a person just interested in Islam and you would Google what is Islam, maybe 3 clicks from that you would be an Salafi recruitment video or ISIS recruitment video, because they are maybe the most popular, or the algorithm thinks this is good for you to know, right? Same thing if you're concerned about migration and replacement of the white race and Cottbus, and you Google what is going on in Cottbus, you would end up on a right-wing extremist website, right? So how do we deal with this kind of mechanism that seems to be on one way reduced, but still very present, as we've seen in Germany in the last couple of weeks, that the ones who seem to dominate the discussion are still the extremists, and it is important to educate people and media literacy, but this is a generational task probably. So what do we do until then? Ms. Dinar, maybe, do you have an idea?
Good question. What do we do until then? I mean, the technology itself won't change so quickly, but we still should think of the people behind it. So I think the people behind it still, they need to be educated or deal with it. We don't come across it, and it's actually a lack of the government to neglect it for over 10 or 15 years. And there is one part that I see also in this, you can go and engage in counter-speech projects. Yeah, but youth who are vulnerable, who want to see it, they will find it. But if you remove it, we had this here before, they are clever. They will find it somewhere else. So if Facebook is not interesting, I will find a clone. Or if I have, actually we know about youth that peer networks are very important in carrying on these messages. So here we have social workers that need to intervene. And that is also the question of how you connect the offline and the online. Also, they are not divided, never, but I just think there are, that actually people need to be more attentive about this, and they need to know what to do. And if they don't know what is the Netz DG, never heard of it, if they don't know how to flag, if they don't know what's their right, what they have signed, I mean, they just clicked and that was it. I mean, we are still not conscious about the dot. So this is a slow thing, and the other part is really to get going, and every one of us can also do something. Like if people would flag more and identify more, probably the numbers would go higher. Maybe platforms would do more about it. If we would know more about the process, we still don't know so much. And I would be really interested in research how NetzDG actually, and we have 40 million users about in Facebook. How many people know of them, of NetzDG? Nobody can answer me this question. You?
No. Maybe it should be in the law that the law needs to be promoted, but I'm not making laws. Dr. Holznagel, so there was also a question about competition and antitrust. Was that also a concern or an idea maybe to do something in that regard? Is that even possible nationally? And if so, how? Or
I mean, that's not my field, but so I can only... I mean, recently Tim Wu, it's a very famous American professor, legal professor, he thought about antitrust law because Facebook and WhatsApp and so on, and he thought antitrust law is not fit to take into account the meaning or the size in terms of how important is the platform for freedom of expression and so on. So I have when you mentioned it, I had an opposite idea, because I thought that we, from the government perspective, it's a very nice thing that they are so centralized and big platforms and not decentralized and small, because this is actually strange. Maybe 10 years ago, we all thought the internet goes in a very decentralized way, 15 years ago. And for example, the copyright war 10 years ago, everyone thought copyright is dead because it's decentralized and there's no big players you can hold accountable and so on. But we have the opposite thing. Actually, Facebook is the most centralized thing, and from an enforcement perspective, this is nice, because you know where to
finally
go.
Something nice. Very good.
Yeah, I mean, if Facebook would be decentralized peer-to-peer things, I don't know.
Okay.
Whoa.
Yeah. All right. More questions, please.
Sorry, can I just add to that?
We have more questions.
Sorry.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Because also we don't have an expert here on that question, but thanks was excellent anyway. Please.
Hello, my name is Bruno. I'm a master student at Hertz School of Governance. Moving a bit from hate speech to disinformation, misinformation. In September, the EU Commission and the internet companies, they announced a EU Code of Practice on disinformation. It's a self-regulatory approach. So Twitter, Facebook, Google, they draft and agreed on the commitments. And I would like to ask if you have any thoughts about this EU code of practice on disinformation, if you think it's a good approach, or if it would be better to have a more normal regulation to tackle disinformation and misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you for adding more complexity. Any more questions? We can.
Yeah, I'm Leonard from the liberal think tank Load. And for me, it's not a matter in which way we are deleting all the hate speech, because the algorithms are also written by computer scientists, so they are also having maybe a political view, if they are leftists or right-wing or whatever. And if we are using humans for selecting if it's wrong or bad, then we are like outsourcing the legal enforcement to companies. Then the companies are outsourcing the decision makers to Philippines, like we have it currently, which are also Chris democratic and maybe are having a different view on the specific topics than we are doing. And I think in the end, it's just a matter of education, just to educate the people that they are not stick with right-wing stories or whatever.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we will address the role of education in radicalization. There seems to be the belief that radicals are stupid. That is kind of not based on the research that is available, but we can discuss that. Another question, please.
Yeah, Veronica Thiel, Algorithm Watch, but I'm here in my private capacity. Just to address the point that you very clearly said just now. The point that education is more important than deleting hate speech is missing the point that you might have to do both, first of all. And second of all, as you're just saying, anticipating my question is, education levels does not mean that people don't fall for this stuff. One of the best examples is Brexit, where despite a lot of things have been said, it is actually not true that most people who voted for Brexit were undereducated and poor. It went through all classes. The question I had more generally was, so people say that, you know, we set bad precedents for other countries who might not have the rule of law and everything like that. Don't you think they would come up with these laws right by themselves?
Yeah. Okay, so we do a quick round if that's possible. Who wants to start?
Okay, so first of all, the misinformation, fake news is a serious problem, and it is being exaggerated by AI technology that allows for the creation of video and audio of world leaders saying just about anything. I think we have to get a handle on this. It has serious national security implications. It has serious democratic election implications. Given the pattern of responses for Silicon Valley for the last 2 decades, I'm not particularly optimistic that they've got it. So I remain concerned about that. The second question was about bias and moderation. I think it's a fair question. I don't really know. I'm not sure I buy the argument that the hashing technology is biased because it's agnostic as to what is being hashed. You make a decision on what you want removed. That, in order to remove bias, should be transparent. You should have due process, you should have clarity of rules, and you should have consistently of the application of rules precisely for that reason so that it is not biased in one direction or another. And then we can argue about whether those rules are appropriate or not. Versus education versus versus hate speech. I'm an educator. This is what I've committed my life to doing. I do think that there is a role of education, but I agree with the person who said earlier, I don't think that it's one or the other. I think it's both. I don't think you can just rely, let's just educate the world and everything. We've been trying that for a long time and it's not working. So I think there has to be a little bit of both.
Excellent. You would like to add?
Sure. So the Code of Practice on Disinformation is, I think it's very new. So kind of, I don't have a substantive opinion of it to articulate yet, but I think it's useful to place it in the context of several other things that the European Commission has done. So there was a code of conduct on hate speech and a code of conduct on terrorist content. And we've seen now with the terrorist content issue that they've moved from the kind of voluntary self-regulation sort of step of the code to proposing a regulation, which is currently before the European Parliament, to mandate certain steps be taken by companies with regard to terrorist content. So, you know, I think I and perhaps others who've been following sort of this process are somewhat suspicious of whether these sort of codes and voluntary approaches are really something that the European Commission is interested in making work, or whether they see this as sort of a necessary first step that they have to exhaust their options before then moving to regulation, which is perhaps what people already think is the solution, and they just want to kind of take the step to kind of soften the blow. So we'll see. In terms of bias and moderation, I mean, it's a real issue. I completely agree with Dr. Farid that the biggest sort of antidote to that is transparency, both in terms of what the rules are and how they're being applied, and that needs to hold for government just as much as for companies. So I think that's something that we probably can all agree on. To the last point about, aren't authoritarians just going to clamp down on speech anyway? Absolutely. I don't think anybody would argue that, just because the Russian Duma has sort of taken Netz DG and copied it and put it before the Duma in Russia, and it's now passed its first reading, and was just at an event yesterday where someone who does human rights work in Russia says they very much expect it to pass early in the next year. If NetzDG didn't exist, would all of a sudden Russia be sort of speech friendly? Of course not. But what NetzDG does is makes it very difficult for Germany to criticize Russia about passing that law, or for civil society or others of us who advocate for free speech to go to Russia and say, hey, this is really not a good idea. And they say, well, the Germans did it. We're just doing what the Germans do. So that's the part that I think is challenging.
So what did you do, Dr. Holznagel?
I mean, this argument is, I find it also partly convincing, but you can look to other examples. For example, in other authoritarian countries, sometimes people are silenced by the abuse of other laws. For example, tax law. There's a famous Russian opposition politician, and there are people who say that the tax law was misused to silence them. I don't say it, but many observers say it. So should we refrain from doing tax laws? Because it's a really complicated. But you're right. It makes it more complicated.
Anything you'd like to add, or shall we get more questions? Do you like?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Let's see if there were more questions. Or are you too hungry? Too much food for thought, now food for stomach time? All right. If there are no more questions, we can do a quick final round. We have 10 minutes left, so maybe 2 minutes each, kind of, roughly.
I'd like my Christmas wish, if you don't mind. I would like everybody to delete their Facebook account, and I would like for Donald Trump to stop tweeting. That's it.
Right. So I'll just make one point that I didn't get a chance to make, which I think deserves to be part of the consideration when we think about sort of these complicated issues around dealing with problematic content. And that is, we have to be very careful not to feed into the narratives that we're trying to rebut, right? And so, one of the things that I thought was interesting about the sort of New Year's Day tweets that were taken down by Twitter as kind of the first test cases under Netz DG was that, I think it's Miss von Storch, right, is the German politician. It took her about 0.3 seconds to quickly then use her platforms, Twitter and otherwise, to sort of use this as complete vindication of the conspiracy against the right in Germany that is not only being, implemented by the German government, but now, they're using their lackeys, large American tech companies. I mean, and you just have to think about if you are somebody who is potentially sympathetic to these kind of right-wing arguments, does that news story and does that sort of episode sort of make you more or less sympathetic to these kind of conspiratorial views? And I think there's a real risk that, especially given how sort of demonized American tech companies have become in Europe in particular, and I'm not arguing that it's necessarily unwarranted, but that by making them the judges and executioner regarding speech, we actually, and so if they do their job and start taking down hateful speech and speech that is considered to sort of lend people towards extremist ideologies, that may actually be self-reinforcing for the extremists.
Okay, important point.
I'm here also, as I said, to remind that people actually need to be protected of hate speech and extremist content, and that I still think there's a big way to do if people really want to use it in a good sense, in a democratic way. That is kind of the lowest level, and that actually nothing a lot happens, that people are really, that are vulnerable, are protected from these things. You take them off, okay, but we don't know really what happens in the heads of these users that use it in Germany, nor do we know if they are really affirmed to the flagging, nor do we know if they identify with community standards, if they are involved, if they are engaged, if they bring out that democratic attitude in this field that you described. And we know hate speech makes them refrain from it, but actually what does them make engage is the next question that I kind of didn't get here to answer, and we don't know, but that's what I would think, that the law only really cuts the top of a cake a bit, but that's about it. And if you want to focus on the people who use it and who is it made for the people here, then I think there's still a lot to do. And there's thinking ahead, I think, that what can you do to protect them? We had the social media council, or a house, a clearing house, a place that is independent from the platform, that can still help people to flag and to engage against hate speech. That's very, very important, because we are still dependent on the platforms itself. It's privatized in there. There's no number you can call. Just a little story. I used to work for Wikimedia, and there was a lot of people who called in wanting to change their Wikipedia article. Yeah, that's kind of because we always said the campaign. There is something about phone numbers, personal and trust, if you're affected, that really would need it also to be implemented if you really take it seriously, that you want to protect people from it.
Thank you. Dr. Holznagel, you had your wishes already, but...
Yeah. So maybe just because it's the last point, I would also share a little bit enforcement reluctant view, because I think you said we cannot be hypocritical with freedom of expression. I think we should be. It's really one of the most important human rights, and we have to. So once we try to do something in this area, we have to be very careful. And so so it's right to be hypocritical also in this area.
All right. Well, that's very fitting. Thank you so much. Also the music itself, I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the panel, for this insightful and very lively discussion, and hope to see you soon another time. Good evening.
Thank you.